I always believed a mother held a sacred place in her child's life. After 42 years of raising Linda, I discovered how painfully wrong I could be. That Thursday afternoon, I had returned early from a doctor's appointment without telling anyone. The kitchen door stood slightly ajar, and that's when I overheard my own daughter speaking on the phone with a friend. My mom has become such a burden in my life. You know, she just doesn't get it. I have my own problems, my marriage, my kids. Sometimes I think it would just be easier if she wasn't here. The words struck me like lightning, and I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. Right there, hiding behind the door of the house where I lived, I discovered I had become a burden to the person I loved most in this world. My name is Emily. I'm 68 years old, and I've been living with my daughter Linda for 3 years, ever since my husband David passed away. I've always been a quiet woman, the kind who prefers to observe before speaking, who solves problems without creating a scene. I raised Linda with boundless love, while David worked tirelessly to provide for our family. I always thought I'd been a good mother, that I had given love, education, and values to my daughter. When she invited me to live with her after I was widowed, I thought it was a gesture of love and gratitude. How devastatingly wrong I was. The house I live in is no longer my house. It's Linda and Michael's house. I occupy the back room, the one that used to serve as storage, and I tried desperately to stay out of the way. During these 3 years, I've realized with growing certainty how much my presence bothers them. The conversations that stop abruptly when I enter the kitchen. The gentle suggestions that I should rest in my room while they entertain visitors. The obligatory kisses from my grandchildren before they rush back to their phones. I had become a shadow in what should have been my home. Michael was never outright rude to me, but his glances spoke volumes. I am an obstacle he must tolerate. Linda tries to hide it, but after what I heard today, I know she feels exactly the same as her husband. Over these years, I've watched them push me aside little by little. At first, they would ask my opinion about meals, about the children, about household decisions. Gradually, those questions became less frequent until they vanished completely. I remember when I first arrived at this house. Linda embraced me at the door and said, "Mom, this is your home now. You're going to be so comfortable here with us." Michael nodded with what I interpreted as a genuine smile. The children ran excitedly to show me the room they had prepared. Everything seemed perfect, like the beginning of a beautiful new chapter in my life. The first few months were relatively calm. I helped with housework. I watched the children when Linda and Michael needed to go out. I cooked on weekends. I felt useful and needed, but slowly I began to notice subtle changes. My suggestions about raising the children were met with forced smiles. My offers to help with cleaning were rejected with, "Don't worry, Mom. We'll take care of it." My attempts to join family conversations were interrupted or simply ignored. At first, I thought it was my imagination, that perhaps I was being too sensitive after losing David. He always told me I had a tendency to overthink things. But over time, the signs became impossible to ignore. Linda started sighing heavily whenever I asked questions. Michael began changing the television channel when I walked into the living room. The children answered with monosyllables when I tried to engage them. I realized that my presence had become uncomfortable for everyone. During family dinners, I was the only one making an effort to sustain conversation. I'd ask about the children's school, about Michael's work, about their weekend plans. The answers were short, polite, but cold. It was as if I were interrupting something, as if my mere presence constituted an intrusion. The weekends were especially difficult. Linda and Michael would make plans that deliberately excluded me. "Mom, we're going out for a bit. You can stay here and rest," they'd say. I would remain home alone, watching television in my room, listening to the silence that filled the empty house. Sometimes I wonder if this is how old furniture feels. Present but ignored, taking up space with no apparent purpose. Diane, my neighbor and only confidant, would visit me on Wednesday afternoons. She was also a widow and understood the loneliness that follows the loss of a life partner. "Emily," she would tell me, "you are too good for them. Linda doesn't know how to appreciate what she has." But I always defended my daughter. I always manufactured excuses for her coldness. She has a very busy life. I'd say times are different now. Families are different. How many times did I lie to myself to protect the love I felt for her? How many times did I pretend not to see the annoyance in her eyes when I appeared at the wrong moment? How many times did I swallow my tears so I wouldn't burden anyone with my widow's grief? I had become an expert at making myself invisible, at not occupying too much space, at not asking for too much. The household routine continued without me. Linda would rise early to prepare breakfast for the children and get Michael ready for work. I would stay in my room until I heard everyone had left, and only then would I emerge to make my own breakfast. I spent the mornings watching television shows on low volume, reading old magazines, organizing and reorganizing my few belongings. The afternoons were for my personal chores. I washed my clothes separately. I cleaned my room meticulously. I kept my things in perfect order. I didn't want to give them any reason to complain. I had learned to be completely self-sufficient inside that house, as if I were a tenant paying rent through invisibility. When Linda returned from work, I would have already prepared dinner. Not because she asked me to, but because it was my way of contributing, of demonstrating that my presence held some value. She would thank me with a tired smile, but she never showed genuine enthusiasm for food I had prepared with such care. Michael ate in silence, focused on his phone. The children wolfed down their food quickly to return to their activities. The nights belonged to loneliness. After washing the dishes and cleaning the kitchen, I would retreat to my room. I could hear the laughter coming from the living room, the animated family conversations, the sounds of a life that continued without me. It was like living adjacent to happiness without being permitted to participate. Sundays were especially painful. That was supposed to be the day families gathered, when we were all meant to be united. But even on those days, I felt like a stranger. Linda and Michael planned activities that subtly excluded me. Mom, we're going to take the kids to the mall. It's a lot of walking for you. It's better if you stay here and rest. Or, we're going to visit Michael's parents. We don't want to trouble you with the long drive. I gradually understood that my place in this family was that of a necessary burden, someone they tolerated out of moral obligation, but not out of genuine desire. I had lost my husband, my house, my independence, and now I was losing my dignity. I had become a shadow moving through the house without purpose, without value, without a future. But that Thursday afternoon, when I heard those cruel words on the phone, something inside me changed forever. For the first time in 3 years, I stopped making excuses for my daughter's behavior. For the first time, I saw the situation with absolute clarity. And for the first time, I began to consider that perhaps it was time to do something about it. What they didn't know was that everything was about to change. Because a woman who had survived 68 years of life, who had raised a daughter, who had faced loss and hardship, was not simply going to accept being treated like unwanted furniture. That night, as we ate dinner in silence, I looked at each of them and made a decision that would change our lives forever. I didn't say a word. I didn't create a scene. I didn't cry. I simply smiled and wished them good night. They had no idea that this was the beginning of the end of the life they knew. That night, I stayed awake very late, staring at the ceiling of my small room, planning every move I would make in the coming days. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman with power to decide, with her own resources, with the ability to change her destiny. Linda had said it would be easier if I wasn't there. Very soon, she would have the opportunity to discover exactly how easy life was without my presence. It was time to teach them the true value of what they were about to lose. And I would do it in the most silent and effective way possible, by simply disappearing from their lives just as they wished. But when I did it, it would be on my terms, not theirs. The sunrise found a different Emily, a woman who had rediscovered her strength, her worth, and her right to be respected. The next few days would mark the beginning of the most important lesson I would ever teach my family. The value of what you have is only appreciated when it's gone. And I was completely prepared to teach them that lesson, no matter how much it hurt me to learn it as well. In that moment, something inside me finally broke. It wasn't a loud shattering. It was quiet, like when a dry branch gives way under the weight of rain. I spent the entire night awake, staring at the ceiling of the back room, remembering when Linda was little and would run to my bed during storms. I would rock her in my arms and sing softly until she fell asleep. Where was that little girl who called me my queen and said that when she grew up, she would take care of me forever? When did I stop being her mother and become her burden? The following days, I began to observe everything with different eyes. The way Linda sighed when I asked her something. The way Michael changed the channel when I walked into the living room. The way my grandchildren responded with one-word answers when I tried to talk to them. I remembered all the times I did laundry, tidied the house, and cooked meals without anyone noticing or saying thank you. I remembered the weekends I spent alone in my room while they went out to have fun. I remember how many times I swallowed my tears so I wouldn't bother anyone with my widow's grief. It was as if I were a ghost living among people who had forgotten I existed. Diane always said I was too good for them, that Linda didn't know how to appreciate what she had. But I always defended my daughter. I always found excuses for her coldness. She has a very busy life. I'd tell her, times are different now. Families are different. How many times did I lie to myself to protect the love I felt for her? How many times did I pretend not to see the contempt in her eyes when I appeared at the wrong moment? I also started to remember things I had chosen to forget. How Linda complained when she had to pick me up from the hospital after my heart surgery. How she sighed when the doctor said I would need special care for a few weeks. How Michael muttered something about additional expenses when they purchased my medications. I had interpreted all of that as worry, as love disguised as stress. But now, after hearing those cruel words on the phone, I finally saw the truth. I really was a burden in their lives. I remembered the day I came to live with them. Linda had insisted so much that I thought she genuinely needed me, that she wanted me close. Mom, you can't stay alone in that big house. You'll have company here. The kids will brighten up your life. But now I realize that perhaps the decision hadn't been out of love, but out of obligation. Maybe Linda felt she had no other choice after David died, that society expected her to care for her widowed mother. The first few months had been a false honeymoon. Linda included me in conversations. She asked for my opinions about meals, about the children. Michael was polite. The grandchildren hugged me when they came home from school. But gradually, that courtesy wore thin. The smiles became forced. The conversations grew shorter. The invitations to participate disappeared. I remember the first time I truly felt like a burden. It had been Mason's birthday, my oldest grandson. I had spent all afternoon making his favorite coconut cream pie, the same one I used to make for Linda when she was a girl. When it was time to sing happy birthday, I was in the kitchen finishing the decorations on the pie. I heard the laughter, the shouts of happy birthday, the entire celebration. When I emerged with the pie, I saw they had already lit the candles on another pie that Linda had bought from the bakery. "Oh, Mom," Linda said with an embarrassed smile, "I forgot to tell you, I already ordered a pie. But yours looks delicious. We'll save it for tomorrow." Michael avoided my gaze. Mason, my grandson, didn't even notice there were two pies. And I, as always, smiled and said it was no problem, that mine could wait. But that night, alone in my room, I cried like I hadn't cried since David's funeral. That had been the beginning. After that, my efforts to contribute were less and less welcome. When I cooked, Linda would say she had eaten a lot at work. When I cleaned, Michael would comment that they had hired a cleaning lady for that purpose. When I offered to watch the children, Linda preferred to take them to her mother-in-law's house because it's closer to my work. Little by little, I withdrew. I stopped offering to help with meals. I stopped suggesting weekend activities. I stopped asking about their lives. And curiously, nobody noticed my absence. The family's life continued exactly the same, as if I were a piece of furniture that had finally stopped being in the way. Diane was the only one who noticed my sadness. "Emily," she'd tell me during our coffee afternoons, "you haven't been the same since you moved in with Linda. You used to be a woman with a spark, with plans, with a will to live. Now you look like a little caged bird." But I didn't know how to explain to her that I felt like a stranger in my own daughter's house, like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The nights were especially difficult. David and I had a habit of talking before bed, sharing our day, making plans for tomorrow. Those nightly conversations had been the heart of our marriage for 45 years. Now, in my small room in the back, the silence spread like a heavy blanket. I listened to the sound of the house, Linda and Michael watching television, the children playing video games, the laughter coming from the living room. All those sounds reminded me that life was continuing without me. One night, while I was fighting insomnia, I heard Linda and Michael arguing in their bedroom. Their voices came muffled to the walls, but I could make out some words. Your mom, space, privacy. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but the tone was one of frustration, of exhaustion. That night, I understood that even in their private moments, I was a source of conflict between them. Sundays had become especially painful. Before, when David was alive, Sundays were family days. We would attend church together, prepare a special meal, have visitors, or visit relatives. Sundays had ritual. They had meaning. Now, Sundays were days to remember everything I had lost. Linda and Michael had developed a Sunday routine that subtly excluded me. They'd wake up late, eat breakfast in their pajamas while watching television, and make spontaneous plans that didn't include me. Mom, we're going to take the kids out for a while. You stay here and rest. And I would remain in the empty house, watching television shows I wasn't interested in, feeling the weight of time stretching out without purpose. I started to miss things I used to take for granted. I missed cooking for someone who truly appreciated the food. I missed having long conversations about topics that interested me. I missed feeling useful, needed, valued. I missed being Emily, not just Linda's mom or the grandmother who lives in the back room. My friend from my old neighborhood had tried to keep in touch at first. They would call me, invite me to their coffee gatherings, to prayer groups, to birthday parties. But Linda's neighborhood was far away, and I depended on her for transportation. Mom, I have commitments that day, or the traffic is too bad to go all the way over there became the usual responses. Gradually, the invitations dwindled, and my friends understood that I was no longer available for the social life we had shared for decades. Loneliness became my constant companion. A strange loneliness because I was surrounded by family, yet I felt more alone than when I lived by myself after David's death. At least then, the loneliness was honest. I knew I was alone and could handle that reality. But this loneliness in the midst of family was confusing, painful in a different way. I started spending more time in my room. Not because they asked me to, but because it was the only place I could be myself without bothering anyone. I reorganized my few belongings, looked through old photo albums, read books I brought from my old house. My world had shrunk to 4 walls and the memories that fit in a small dresser. One afternoon, while organizing my papers, I found letters David had written to me when we were courting. Letters full of plans, of dreams, of promises about the future we would build together. One of the letters said, Emily, when we're old, we're going to sit on the porch of our house and watch life go by, surrounded by the love of our children and grandchildren. Reading those words, I realized how different reality had turned out. David had died convinced that I would be well cared for, surrounded by Linda and her family's love. His last words had been, Take good care of her, honey. Your mom gave everything for us. Linda had cried and promised she would always take care of me, that I would never want for anything. And technically, I didn't want for anything. I had a roof, food, clean clothes. But I was missing the most important thing, feeling loved, valued, and respected. The memories of my life before being widowed became more vivid during those lonely afternoons. David and I had been a team. He worked at the hardware store in our small town. I cared for the house and raised Linda. But it wasn't just housekeeping. I was the administrator, the decision maker, the problem solver. David consulted me on everything. He valued my opinions. He treated me like his partner in life. I remember the afternoons we spent planning Linda's future, her education, her quinceañera, her wedding. We were 2 parents working together to give our daughter the best life possible. Linda had studied business at the university in the city. She had married Michael. She had secured a good job. We had achieved everything we set out to do. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped being the mother who fought for her dreams and had become the burden holding back her happiness. I remembered Linda's wedding day. David and I had spent all our savings to give her the celebration she dreamed of. I had sewn her dress with my own hands, working for months on every detail. On the wedding day, when I saw her walk down the aisle, David and I held hands and cried with pride. "We did it, Emily," he whispered in my ear. "Our little girl is going to be very happy." But I also remembered something I had forgotten. After the ceremony, during the reception, I heard Michael comment to a friend, "Good thing Linda's parents live in that small town. We're not going to have the problem of clingy in-laws." At the time, I hadn't thought anything of it. I assumed it was just nervous, newlywed humor. Now, I realized that perhaps it had been a declaration of intent. The first years of Linda's marriage were happy for everyone. David and I would visit occasionally. They would come to our hometown for important holidays. There was a geographical distance that kept the relationship cordial. When Mason and Hope were born, I would go to help for the first few weeks, but then I'd return to my house. I was a loving grandmother who visits and leaves before becoming a bother. Everything changed when David got sick. The cancer took him in 6 months. 6 terrible months during which Linda helped me as much as she could. She came on weekends. She accompanied me to doctor's appointments when possible. She stayed with me during the hardest nights. I thought those months had strengthened our relationship, that we had rediscovered the mother-daughter connection that seemed to have faded over the years. After the funeral, Linda insisted I couldn't stay alone in the house in our hometown. "Mom, there are too many sad memories here. Come with us to the city. The kids will cheer you up. You'll have company. You won't be lonely." Her argument sounded so convincing, so full of genuine love and concern, that I agreed without thinking twice. Now I realized that perhaps Linda had felt obligation more than desire. Maybe society, her friends, the extended family expected her to care for her widowed mother. Maybe Michael had agreed because he had no other socially acceptable option. Maybe the children had accepted because they had no say in the decision. The process of moving had been painful. I had to dispose of most of my belongings. The furniture David and I had purchased over 45 years of marriage. The material memories of a lifetime. "Don't worry, Mom," Linda told me. "At home, we have everything you need. Just bring your clothes and your personal things." But a house isn't just furniture. A house is autonomy. It's privacy. It's the right to decide what to do with your time and your space. By moving in with Linda, I had surrendered all of that without realizing what I was losing. I had traded the honest loneliness of widowhood for the disguised loneliness of family life. During those sleepless nights in the back room, I began to understand that the problem wasn't just that I felt unloved. The problem was that I had lost my identity. For 65 years, I had been Emily, David's girlfriend, David's wife, Linda's mother, the homemaker, the decision-maker. Now I was simply Linda's mom who lives with us. My days had no purpose other than not bothering anyone. I rose when everyone had left, ate breakfast alone, watched television, read, and waited for them to return. It was an existence without goals, without challenges, without the satisfaction of feeling useful. It was like being in a permanent waiting room, waiting for something that never arrived. One afternoon, while Diane and I were having coffee at the small table in my room, she asked me a question that resonated for days. "Emily, do you think David would be happy to see you like this?" The question hurt because I knew the answer. David had loved my strength, my independence, my ability to solve problems. He had admired the way we raised Linda together, how I managed the house and finances when he was sick. David would never have wanted to see me transformed into a shadow, hiding so as not be a bother. He would have told me, "Emily, you are worth so much more than this. Don't let anyone make you feel like a burden." But David wasn't here anymore to remind me who I really was, to give me the strength I needed to defend myself. That night, after Diane's visit, I lay awake thinking about everything I had lost. My house, my independence, my identity, my purpose, my dignity. But I also thought about what I still had. My savings, my health, my experience, my intelligence. I was a 68-year-old woman, not an invalid. I had resources. I had options. I had the ability to change my situation. For the first time in months, I felt like something more than a victim of circumstances. I felt like a woman with the power to decide. And if it was true that my presence was a burden to Linda and her family, if it really would be easier for them if I wasn't there, then perhaps it was time to give them exactly what they wanted. But I would do it on my own terms, not theirs. For the next 2 weeks, I transformed into a different person, but nobody noticed. I kept doing my normal routine, waking up early, making coffee, making my bed, watching television on low volume. But inside, I was planning every move with the precision of someone who isn't in a hurry, but is certain of what they want. I had learned something important in life. The best decisions are made in silence, far from prying eyes and unsolicited advice. First, I went to the bank and withdrew all my savings, $62,000 that David had left for me. Money I had never touched because I wanted to leave it as an inheritance for Linda and the grandchildren. What irony! Thinking about that now. Then I asked Diane to help me find a small apartment to rent. "You finally come to your senses," she said, and I just smiled. We found a perfect place, a one-bedroom apartment in a simple building, far from that house where I was no longer welcome. The hardest part was canceling the automatic transfer I made every month to Linda's account. $500 that I deposited faithfully to help with household expenses. She never knew that money came from my savings. I think she always assumed it was from my pension. Michael also didn't know that I was paying half of the electricity and water bills. They would discover it when the bills arrived next month, and they had to cover all the expenses themselves. Meanwhile, I watched the family continue their routine, treating me like a piece of furniture. Linda complaining about work, Michael watching television, the grandchildren glued to their phones. None of them noticed that I had stopped doing certain things. I didn't do their laundry anymore. I didn't tidy up the living room. I didn't make dinner on weekends anymore. It was incredible how they only noticed my presence when they want to complain about something, but they never noticed when I stopped doing the tasks that made their lives easier. The process of planning my exit gave me something back that I had lost: control over my own life. For the first time in 3 years, I was making important decisions without having to ask permission or justify myself to anyone. It was an intoxicating feeling, like remembering how to walk after being in a wheelchair for a long time. During those 2 weeks, I began to see my situation with clarity I hadn't had before. I realized I had been living like a permanent guest in a house where my presence was tolerated but not desired. I had been apologizing for existing, shrinking my personality to not occupy too much space, silencing my needs so I wouldn't be a bother. But not anymore. It was time to remind everyone who Emily truly was. The apartment hunt was an exciting adventure. Diane came with me to see 3 different options. The first was too small. The second was in a neighborhood I didn't like. But the third was perfect. It had a small but bright living room, a comfortable bedroom, a functional kitchen, and most importantly, a balcony with space for plants that reminded me of the garden David and I had cared for together for years. "This is it," I told Diane as soon as we walked in. "I'm going to be happy here." The woman renting the apartment, Mrs. Miller, was an older woman like us, also a widow. When I explained my situation without going into painful details, she nodded with understanding. "Oh, dear. It's a good thing you made this decision. A woman shouldn't live where she isn't valued." The rental process was surprisingly easy. I had good credit history, solid references, and the money to pay 3 months up front. I signed the lease that same day. For the first time in years, I had my own space again, a place where I could make my own rules, watch television at the volume I wanted, and have visitors whenever I felt like it. Diane helped me purchase the basic furniture. Nothing fancy, just the essentials: a queen-size bed like the one I had shared with David, a small dresser, a round table for 2, a comfortable armchair for watching television, and some kitchen utensils. I wanted the place to be ready for when I decided to move in permanently. The hardest part of the entire process was keeping the secret. Every day I spent in that house feeling invisible, knowing that soon I would be completely free, was like holding a treasure that no one else could see. There were moments when I wanted to scream the truth at them, that I didn't depend on them, that I had options, that I could live perfectly well without their forced charity. But I held back. I had learned that the best lessons are taught with actions, not words. During those days of preparation, I started to watch my family with the eyes of someone who would soon be a stranger. Linda would come home from work tired and irritable. She complained about everything, the traffic, her boss, the household expenses. Michael lived glued to the television or his phone. He barely participated in family conversations. The grandchildren were in their teenage world, absorbed in their devices and school problems. I realized that I had been the silent glue keeping some family routines functioning. When I stopped making them dinner on Sundays, they had to improvise. When I stopped folding the laundry that came out of the dryer, it piled up in baskets for days. When I stopped cleaning the living room after their television nights, the house started to look neglected. But nobody said anything. Nobody asked if I was feeling okay, if I needed help, if something was wrong. They just assumed it was part of my new way of not bothering them. It was as if they confirmed all my suspicions about how little they truly valued me. One night, while we were eating in the usual silence, Mason commented, "Grandma, you don't make your rice pudding on Sundays anymore." It was the first time in weeks that anyone had mentioned something I used to do for them. "You're right, sweetheart," I replied with a smile. "I don't make it anymore." Linda looked up from her plate for a moment, but said nothing. Michael kept chewing as if he hadn't heard. That small interaction confirmed something important. My contributions to this family had been noticed and valued, at least by the grandchildren, but nobody was going to acknowledge it until it was too late. Diane had been my silent accomplice during the entire process. She understood better than anyone the importance of what I was doing. "Emily," she told me one afternoon while we were having coffee in my future apartment, "what you're doing takes tremendous courage. Not every woman our age dares to start over." "I'm not starting over, Diane," I replied. "I'm going back to being who I always was." And it was true. During those weeks of preparation, I felt as if I were waking from a long, confusing dream. The Emily who had raised Linda with firmness and love, who had managed household finances for 45 years, who had made tough decisions during David's illness. That woman had never left. She had just been asleep. Hidden beneath layers of deference and self-sacrifice, I had adopted to survive in Linda's house. I packed my belongings gradually, without anyone noticing. I didn't have many things. When I moved in with Linda, I had to dispose of almost everything. But I had the essentials: my clothes, some photographs, important documents, jewelry David had given me, my favorite books. Everything fit into 3 medium-sized boxes that Diane stored at her house. The plan was simple but effective. One Friday morning, when everyone had left for work and school, I would walk out of that house forever. I would leave a letter explaining my decision, without giving details about where I was going or how to contact me. I wanted them to experience exactly what they had said they wanted: my total absence from their lives. But before I left, I had a few more things to do. I went to the bank and closed a joint savings account I had with Linda. Since I was widowed, it had been a precautionary measure, she had suggested. "In case anything happens to you, Mom." Now I realized it had been more of a way to have access to my money, if they ever needed it. There wasn't much in that account, but it was mine, and I took it all. I also made changes to my will. Originally, all my money and my few possessions were designated for Linda and the grandchildren. Now, a considerable portion would go to Diane, who had been my only true friend during these difficult years. Another portion would go to a foundation that helped elderly women in vulnerable situations. Linda and the grandchildren would still receive something, because despite everything, they were still my family, but they would no longer be my sole heirs. These legal changes gave me a sense of power I hadn't felt in years. I was taking control not only of my present, but also of my future, and what would remain after I was gone. I was no longer the passive woman who accepted what others decided for her. I was a woman who made her own decisions and lived with the consequences. During the last week before my departure, I watched my family with a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because, despite everything, I loved them, and I knew the separation would cause them pain. Relief because I had finally found the courage to do what I needed to do to save my dignity and my peace of mind. Linda seemed especially stressed that week. She had been having problems at work. Michael had been more irritable than usual, and the children were in the middle of exams. I watched her deal with all these problems while I remained quiet in my corner, offering no help or advice. For the first time in years, she had to handle family crises completely alone. It was interesting to see how the family functioned when I wasn't available as an emotional release valve. Linda had no one to share her work frustrations with. Michael didn't have anyone to serve him coffee, just the way he liked it. The grandchildren didn't have anyone to make them their favorite snacks. Small things, but altogether they made daily life harder and less comfortable. On Thursday night, my last night in that house, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake reviewing the 3 years I had lived there, remembering the good and bad moments. There had been good moments. The laughter with the grandchildren, some affectionate conversations with Linda, the quiet family dinners. But those moments had become increasingly rare, drowned out by the constant tension of feeling unwanted. I got up several times during the night to look out my window. The house was silent. Everyone was sleeping soundly. For them, it was a normal night. They didn't know it was the last night we would spend under the same roof. Tomorrow night, when they came home from work and school, they would find my absence and a letter explaining why I was no longer there. The letter had been the hardest thing to write. I wanted to be honest but not cruel, firm but not vengeful. I wanted them to understand my reasons without making them feel excessively guilty. After several drafts, I had managed to write something that expressed my feelings without being destructive. Dear Linda, the letter began. Since you said it would be easier if I wasn't here, I decided it was time for you to find out how easy life really is without this burden around. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. You're all going to discover what life is like without this obstacle around. I wish you all happiness. With love, Mom. I left no address. I left no phone number. I gave no explanations beyond those lines. They wanted me to disappear from their lives, so that was exactly what I was going to do. Friday dawned sunny and beautiful. It was as if the universe was celebrating my new beginning. I waited until everyone was gone. Linda to work, Michael to the office, the grandchildren to school. When the house was empty, I retrieved my 3 boxes from Diane's house and placed them in the taxi she had called for me.